Were buffalo more dangerous than wolves? Were you more likely to get run over by your own wagon than you were to get attacked by Native Americans? There was no shortage of ways to die on the Oregon Trail, and these are the worst of them. A traveler on the Oregon Trail might be racked by anxiety over any number of problems. How would they get food on the long journey? How would they defend themselves? For many, the answer was to get a gun. Simple enough, right? While the guns themselves may have been more dangerous than many of their amorphous spears, many immigrants carried loaded weapons that had been placed without modern locks and cases in their wagons, and with no such things as safeties or even proper manufacturing to keep them from discharging accidentally. And they did just that. Other pioneers had poor aim or judgment, striking members of their traveling party when they meant only to hunt animals or ward off a supposed attacker. Some were unfamiliar with guns and simply didn't know how to handle firearms safely.
Every time you pull a hammer back, it puts a new round in position.
Round?
A bullet.
Oh.
One man, ironically named John Shotwell, was one of the first known firearm deaths on the trail. According to diarist John Bidwell, Shotwell died on May 13, 1841, when he accidentally shot himself in the chest while removing his gun from his wagon. Though starvation was more likely to affect draft animals like horses and oxen instead of humans, it did occasionally strike some of the most unfortunate, and when it did, the deaths that resulted could be grim indeed. Death from starvation is a long, drawn-out process that attacks a body's organs, lowers a person's immune system, and can end with hallucinations, convulsions, and heart arrhythmia. This is the fate that befell a small number of people in the Utter Van Ornum wagon train in September of 1860. After eventually losing their military escort, the group was attacked by 100 or so Native Americans, who may or may not have been accompanied by a small number of white men, according to the Oregon Historical Society. 11 people were killed outright, while the rest ditched their wagons and split into groups. The group that decided to stay behind instead of forging ahead did not fare well. The lack of supplies caused the death of 5 people, 4 of them children, and pushed others to resort to cannibalism. Today, the place where they waited is starkly known as Starvation Camp. And of course, it's all been impossible to discuss starvation during the Oregon Trail era and not mention the Donner Party. Technically, the group of ill-fated pioneers only traveled part of the way on the Oregon Trail, splitting off to take what they believed to be a shortcut to California. But by late 1846, this group would find themselves stranded in the snowy Sierra Nevadas and contemplating the consumption of the dead around them. A total of 42 died, leaving behind 47 survivors and a grim legacy. Rivers were another danger that travelers faced on the Oregon Trail. Getting their families, animals, and supplies across a river could be pretty perilous, especially if the waters were high and moving quickly. Some major rivers, like the Kansas and Columbia, saw hundreds of deaths from pioneers attempting to cross. Wyoming's Green River was said to be especially deadly. In 1850 alone, of the people who attempted to ford the Green River, records note 37 drowning victims. Wyoming's North Platte River was likewise a well-known killer, with cold, fast-moving waters that routinely took both human and animal lives. Eventually, some crossings were made easier with bridges and ferry boats, but that didn't totally eliminate the danger. Some ferry operators, more interested in making money than upholding high standards of safety, dangerously overloaded their boats, which would sometimes result in completely avoidable deaths. Today, dysentery has morphed into a strange little joke about the Oregon Trail, thanks to one morbid ending you might meet while playing the vintage Oregon Trail computer game. But it was hardly a laughing matter for the people who traveled the real-life route. As 19th century historian Francis Parkman wrote in the Oregon Trail, his experience with the illness proved that it was, quote, a thing too serious for a joke. He wrote of intense weakness and inability to keep down food, both of which brought before him the all-too-real specter of starvation. Thankfully, Parkman recovered, but not all who suffered from dysentery did. The gastrointestinal infection can be caused by several different bacteria or amoebic parasites that thrive in poor sanitary conditions. They can induce intense vomiting, painful abdominal cramps, and dangerous levels of dehydration. Today, the worst cases are treated by medication and intravenous fluids, but travelers on the Oregon Trail had very little access to such medical care. To treat the ravages of the infection, which could include bloody diarrhea, some immigrants turned to a dose of castor oil. However, being that it is a laxative, it likely did more harm than good. Though it wasn't one of the most common ways to die on the Oregon Trail, the effects of water hemlock poisoning were surely among the most painful and grotesque ways to go. During pioneer times, it was so feared that it gained a reputation as one of the most deadly plants in the region. The active compound in water hemlock, sicutoxin, is most concentrated in its hollow roots, though it's found in dangerous levels throughout the plant. Of course, very few people would have knowingly consumed water hemlock. Instead, it was more likely to be mistakenly eaten by desperate pioneers facing starvation. Some appear to have confused the plant with wild parsnip, which was known to have edible roots. But dining on water hemlock was a potentially deadly mistake that could induce vomiting, delirium, and a painful death. Even today, water hemlock still grows in regions along the trail and remains a very real danger for pets, livestock, and the occasional human who consumes it. The Prairie Schooner, a covered wagon that's now indelibly associated with the history of the Oregon Trail, was a hefty vehicle. On average, it weighed about 1,300 pounds and would have been even heavier when loaded down with supplies and people, generally topping out at about 2,000 pounds.
That's heavy.
However, Pioneer wagons typically had no suspensions, meaning that many travelers found it more comfortable to just get out and walk. But this put them in serious danger, as many things could go wrong. For instance, clothes might catch on a piece of the vehicle while moving in and out of the wagon, causing them to get dragged under. Or spooked draft animals might start running and jostle people from the wagon and into the path of the deadly wheels. Numerous accounts from the Oregon Trail tell heartbreaking stories of individuals suddenly taken by such accidents. Lucia Lorraine Williams, who traveled the trail with her family in the 1850s, lost her young son Johnny this way when he fell from a baggage wagon in Wyoming. She wrote in a letter to her mother, "Poor little fellow, we could do nothing for him. He was beyond our reach, and oh, how suddenly, 1/2 hour before we had left him in health, as lively as a lark, and then to find him breathless so soon was awful. I cannot describe to you our feelings." Throughout much of history, birth has been extraordinarily dangerous. The statistics on maternal mortality in the early 19th century paint a grim picture. Though the best data in this era comes from Europe, it's clear that a birthing parent frequently risked deadly complications, including infections caused by unwashed doctors. It's all too easy to imagine how poorly things could go for someone whose labor went south while on the trail, far from the knowledgeable folks who could have eased her pain, saved her life, or saved her baby's life. This isn't pure conjecture either. Take the sad case of Elizabeth Paul, who died in western Wyoming. Paul gave birth to her 8th child, a daughter, on the trail on July 27, 1862, and died soon thereafter. As fellow traveler Hamilton Scott wrote, "She has been very poorly for some time. We buried her this evening under a large pine tree and put a post and railing fence around her grave." The baby girl, named Elizabeth, died just a week later. Paul's gravesite can still be visited in the Bridger-Teton National Forest. While dysentery was certainly an awful way to go, it was also something from which people often recovered, even considering how sparse medical care could be on the Oregon Trail. But cholera, however, was another story.
You know cholera? The black the latest offering in the Frontiers Disease of the Month Club.
Like common forms of dysentery, cholera is caused by bacteria that thrive under poor sanitary conditions. It also takes its victims via diarrhea and subsequent dehydration. But where dysentery could be awful but survivable for many, cholera was known to be seriously deadly. It moved alarmingly fast, too, as those who were infected could die within 24 hours or less. They might have seemed fine in the morning, but as the day wore on, the infection caused them to experience sudden vomiting, cramps, and convulsions. Toward the end of their ordeal, those infected with cholera might even have blue or purple faces, a side effect of dehydration and the deoxygenation of their thickened blood. Of the thousands of graves that were laid alongside the Oregon Trail, a significant portion of them likely contained victims of cholera. The reality of the Oregon Trail shows that attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare and killed fewer than 400 people during the 20-year period of trail usage. Settlers were more apt to be alarmed by stories than actual encounters with hostile indigenous people, but the few occasions where it did happen could be brutal. Relations between white pioneers and indigenous people had become especially poor in the latter half of the 19th century and west of the Rockies, as tribes found their lands and ways of life encroached upon by growing numbers of settlers. In 1854 Idaho, the Ward Massacre saw a 20-person party almost completely decimated by Shoshone. Only 2 young boys were believed to have survived out of the Oregon Bottom group. And of course, the previously mentioned Utter Van Ornum attack in 1860 resulted in many deaths and left some of the survivors to resort to cannibalism. While wolves and coyotes inhabited much of the territory in which pioneers traveled, settlers were more often unnerved by the animals howling than harmed by them. The same goes for many other creatures.
It's only a squirrel! He's got something in his hand! Something inside!
What they really had to look out for was venomous snakes. As diarist Valina Williams related, she had an alarming encounter with a copperhead on one occasion in 1853. As published in the Transactions of the Oregon Pioneer Association, she wrote, "I found myself standing on a copperhead snake. He was coiled, and my foot was across the coil so that the head was fortunately too nearly under my foot to injure me." Meanwhile, the herds of bison that provided food, fur, and other goods for pioneers and native people alike could prove treacherous as well. Occasionally, wagon trains were said to be caught in a massive stampede of buffalo. While traveling in 1842 Wyoming, Ezra Meeker and his party were caught in one such nighttime rush. He wrote in his book, The Busy Life of 85 Years of Ezra Meeker, Ventures and Adventures, "A roar like an approaching storm could be heard in the distance. How long they were passing we forgot to note. It seemed like an age." However, there is little record of anyone killed by buffalo. Instead, the huge animals had far more cause to fear humans than the other way around. Just by looking at the covered wagons used by many travelers on the Oregon Trail, it's clear that pioneers were occasionally seriously vulnerable. Sure, the canvas that arched over their vehicles was typically weatherproofed and offered some protection from the sun and rain, but that could only go so far. Thunderstorms, particularly on the great expanse of plains before the Rocky Mountains, could be catastrophic, especially if the only cover someone had was the oiled cloth over the wagon that still let in driving rains and howling winds. Pioneers often faced thunderstorms that brought pounding rain, high winds, flashes of lightning, and hailstones that could be large enough to crack skulls. 19th century settlements on the Great Plains were known to be occasionally hit by deadly tornadoes as well. Lightning represented a particular hazard on the wide open expanse of the plains. As T.M. Barber wrote, traveler J.M. Hurd was struck by lightning while crossing the Elkhorn River in 1851 in Nebraska. He recalled, "He was struck on the right arm, entered his body on right breast and passed entirely through to his ankles, where it passed from him through his boots, leaving a hole in each boot the size of a picayune. Of course, death was instant."